各位朋友，晚上好！欢迎您观看服务器艺术、当代影像、路径及其可能第13期线上论坛。我们非常荣幸地邀请到国际摄影中心的名誉院长、摄影理论家弗雷德·里钦、摄影评论家、摄影家、策展人姜荣、艺术理论家臧策、青年学者陈国森，围绕摄影在 AI 时代的转型展开分享和讨论。本次线上论坛由斯蒂芬·肖尔的学生夏静怡担任翻译，在此表示感谢。接下来有请主持人、艺术理论家臧策老师。
今天的主持人臧策，欢迎大家来到服务器艺术、当代影像、路径及其可能第13期。我们今天非常荣幸地邀请到了国际摄影中心的名誉院长、摄影理论家、策展人弗雷德·里钦先生，为我们做主题分享。他分享的主题是摄影在 AI 时代的转型。同时呢，我们还邀请了著名的摄影评论家、摄影家、策展人姜荣老师和复旦大学哲学院的艺术哲学系博士生陈国森老师一起呢来参加讨论。我们同时还邀请了毕业于美国纽约州文理学院巴德学院的摄影系的夏静怡老师。他就是肖尔的学生，上次在肖尔的那次对话中，他也成功的非常好的担任了翻译。好，我们对这几位的嘉宾呢表示非常的感谢，请大家跟这个观众朋友们一起问个好。好，观众朋友们好，
观众
几位嘉
好。
宾好。我们今天的这个讲座的题目呢非常重要，相信呢大家都也非常关心，因为呢这个我们摄影在今天的 AI 时代到底会面临哪些问题，这是一个大家都非常关注的问题。恰好呢，李钦先生在不久前刚刚出版了他的新作，叫《合成之眼：摄影在人工智能时代的转型》。一本非常好的一本特别新的专著。那么这本书呢，可能如果这个对翻译成中文的话呢，还会需要一段时间。那么我们今天非常有幸的呢，把李钦先生请到了现场，面对面的跟我们分享他的这本书的主要内容，让我们国内的读者可以先睹为快。所以呢，今天的这个讲座是非常重要的，包括我本人在内也都是非常期待的。好，我话不多说，下面就先有请李钦先生开始今天的讲座。
Okay, well, thank you for the invitation, and I'm happy to share some ideas with everybody. So I'll begin here. So I've been writing since 1984 about the impact of digital imaging on photography, how it works, how we think about it, what it can do in the world. And so the newest book I did is called The Synthetic Eye: Photography Transformed in the Age of AI, of Artificial Intelligence. The first book I did is the upper left, In Our Own Image, the coming revolution in photography. That was 1990. And it's the first book on the impact of the digital revolution on photography. And the intent was to really let people know what was coming. This came out before Photoshop was released. The idea was the issues I knew we would have to grapple with in the years to come. And so I published that first book. The cover image is the first computer-generated film to win an Academy Award. And after that, I did After Photography, which was published 2009. And that was the sense that what we thought of as photography was largely over. We had to reinvent it. And Bending the Frame was a reinvention. It was 2013. And the idea there was, what can we do differently? How do we bend the frame of photography so it can still function in the world and have impact? And the most recent is The Synthetic Eye. The cover here is an AI image that I had generated with the prompt asking for romantic Martians as if seen by H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells was the writer who wrote quite a lot about the invasion of the Martians. And part of what I've been doing is seeing what kinds of images non-photographers might make if they actually if we're able to simulate the photograph. What would it look like if a musician made photographs, if a writer did? Obviously, these are not photographs, but they simulate the photorealistic. So this began basically in 2019, the use of AI with imagery. There was a website, and I'll just add that the After Photography book was also published in Chinese by the University of Nanjing. So this use of artificial intelligence to simulate the photographic image began in a popular way with a website called This Person Does Not Exist in 2019. So this was on your cell phone. You were able to just keep refreshing and get all these different images of what looks like people, but they never existed. This was done to really warn us about what was coming with artificial intelligence and how difficult it would be in the future to tell the difference between images that look like photographs and images that simulate photographs. So all of this began before artificial intelligence with the ability to easily manipulate the photograph. This was early uses of Photoshop. So for example, this is Pedro Mayer, the Mexican photographer, on the left with his son. And on the right, this is Pedro Mayer with his father. So it's the same person two times as the father and the son. And it indicates several decades ago what one could expect family albums to turn into. You can take out the spouse who's divorced. You could add people from different generations, and the photograph itself becomes malleable. So in a very well-known way, the manipulation of the photograph in magazines and newspapers, the landmark case is this one from 1982, which is 8 years before Photoshop. In those days, you used a Cytex machine or its equivalent, which cost between about $500,000 and $1.5 million. And so in this case, they had a photograph at National Geographic of the pyramids of Giza in Egypt, and they needed to fit it on the cover, which was vertical. So when I interviewed 2 years later, in 1984, the editor of National Geographic, he told me it was really no big deal. All we did was go back in time and move the photographer a few feet to one side to get a different point of view. In other words, they moved the left pyramid behind the right pyramid so it would fit. And so in 1984, he told me it's just going back in time and moving the photographer to get a new perspective. It was no big deal, but to me, it was science fiction. So the article that I wrote for the New York Times Magazine, which was the first major article published in the world, as far as I know, was in 1984. I introduced the idea of pixels, picture elements, because people did not know what it was at that time. And I wrote in it that in the not too distant future, realistic looking images will probably have to be labeled like words as either fiction or nonfiction, because it may be impossible to tell them apart, and that we may have to rely on the image maker and not the image to tell us into which category certain pictures fall. Are they fiction or are they nonfiction? So this was a photograph I published in the New York Times Magazine in 1984. of New York City and working with a Cytex machine with a technician. In those days, you needed 3 screens. You had to study for 2 weeks to be able to do it. It was not simple the way Photoshop began to be in the 1990s. So I showed many changes. So I brought the Transamerica Pyramid from San Francisco into New York. I brought the Eiffel Tower from Paris. I created a traffic jam around the Eiffel Tower. If you see on the right, the Citicorp Tower, I turned the top of it around. I moved the Empire State Building uptown a few blocks and made it taller. And there were very small things, like if you look at the water on the right, I added a pier to the water. So the idea here was to show how easy it would be to change a photograph and also to do things that people recognize as changes because they're major, but also more minor things so that you can compare them. And again, it was meant as a warning as to what was coming at that time. 1,600,000 copies of the magazine were printed, but I only got 3 letters to the editor of people interested in 1984. So at that period, and this is 1994, as magazines in the United States started to use this more, O.J. Simpson was arrested. He was a celebrity, a sports star, on suspicion of 2 murders. And the same day, Time magazine published the mugshot by the police from Los Angeles. It was published in Newsweek on the left, and on the right, Time magazine manipulated it. They made it darker, out of focus. They added the effect of a spotlight. And there was a lot of protest. And 1 week later, the editor-in-chief said, in explaining this, he said, all we did was take a common mugshot, a police photograph, and raise it to the level of art with no sacrifice to truth. So he's arguing the picture on the right is art somehow with no sacrifice to truth. And this was really perhaps the height of the moment when people understood how easy it would be to change a photograph, which was often done mostly for covers of magazines, advertising, before Photoshop became more and more popular. And it changes the idea of the photograph as a recording of the visible, as a testimony to what was visible, what happened. And there were, as I remember, 800 letters to the editor and 790 accused Time magazine of being racist, because when he was a celebrity, O.J. Simpson, he was lighter skinned, but when he was accused of 2 murders, they made him darker skinned. And this was, as far as I know, the first future news photograph. Photography is normally of the present, seen as the past, but this was 2 ice skaters competing for the Olympics who were having a feud, a problem between them. And this is a picture of the 2 of them meeting the next day. Photography cannot normally photograph the next day. And it explains on the bottom right that it's a composite illustration, but this was the beginning of using photography to depict the future, which photography normally does not do. This is again 1994. So this is on the right, the Lance Corporal, the soldier named Boudreaux. He saved my dad. This is in Iraq, and he rescued my sister. On the left, it's Lance Corporal Boudreaux. He killed my dad, and he knocked up my sister. He made her pregnant. So I asked the US military which one was correct, because both of them were online. And they said at the time that after 1 year of study, they did not know. So what people were doing online was just making up signs saying whatever they wanted to say. The actual photograph, there's a boy on each side of the soldier. But this indicates how it's difficult to know what's going on in the world because it's so easy to manipulate the photograph, which is very different than film photography, which, as Susan Sontag compared it, for example, as a footprint. It's not something that normally is manipulated to this extent. So I assume the one on the right is correct. So this was of a Swedish airplane crash published in, I believe, 8 newspapers in Finland as a news photograph, but there was no photographer present. So what they did was they asked eyewitnesses what it looked like. They composited the image, but they've just published it in the 1990s as a news photograph with no photographer, no camera. Later on, they found I was told, a film, a video, which was very similar to what they composited. But the idea is you don't need a photographer, you don't need a camera, you can make it up, which is in fact what happens with artificial intelligence now. So in 1994, I proposed a new standard for photographic reproduction in the media. And when the photograph was heavily manipulated, you would put a symbol, it's a lens inside a square, you would put the diagonal line through it so the reader would know it's heavily manipulated. You could then conceivably click on the symbol and find out how it was manipulated. The idea being it's important to be honest and open with the reader so they know if the photograph itself was manipulated. This is 1994. This is several decades before artificial intelligence. So none of these arguments indicate that photograph is the truth. Photography is always subjective. It's always interpretive. But conventionally, we think of it, particularly in a journalistic way or documentary way, as a recording of the visible, or what John Berger called a quotation from appearances. So it's not the truth. I'm not arguing in any way it's ever been the truth, but I am arguing that conventionally, photography has been thought of as a recording of the visible. So this was a use by the Swedish government, which I thought to be positive. They made a fake cover of a glamorous young woman, but to show the manipulation, I think largely out of fear, they did not want other young women to try to look like her when in fact she did not exist. You could click on her mouth, her nose, her eyes, her hair, any part of her, and find out what she actually looks like. So this was educational to show that much of what we see in the media is manipulation and does not exist. Again, this is before artificial intelligence, but in a sense, what they're saying is that these are not actual people. These are images that have been manipulated. So this is the first, or one of the early artificial intelligence covers. This is for Vogue. It's their first artificial intelligence cover for Vogue Portugal. And it began a kind of a sense that in fashion photography, it's possible not to need a photographer, not to need a model, not to need makeup people. And the argument that certain companies have made is that way you get more diversity. You could get all kinds of different body types, heavy people, thin people, tall people, short people, different ethnic groups, that they would not be able to afford if they had to hire models, photographers, and makeup people. So it's an interesting moment where there are now fashion studios beginning with no photographers and no models anymore. It's all, it can become just artificial intelligence. So just going back, this was the first photograph of the Earth from outer space, 1968, Christmas Eve. 16 months later, the Earth Day began in April 1970. Inspired by this photograph, there were postage stamps around the world made on the basis of this, that we have to take care of our planet. So one of the issues is that if people do not believe the photograph represents an actuality, something that actually exists, then it cannot provoke change because people just don't believe it happened. And sometimes the photograph has been very, very important in provoking positive change in the world. And one of the problems now is whether that can continue. So this is another example, 1972, where a photograph was helpful to end the war in Vietnam. The following year, 1973, the United States pulled out all its soldiers from the war. So again, with all the violence in the world, photographs have at times been helpful in provoking change for the better, helping to end a war earlier, and so on. This, unfortunately, happens less and less, as we see in current conflicts, for example, in Ukraine and Gaza. Or this one also during the Vietnam War, where this image of protest against the war, putting the flower in front of the soldiers, was very influential in helping the protest movement in the United States against the war. So the photograph itself, in part because at that point we had a printed press, it wasn't just online, and also because we had a front page of newspapers, magazines, and also because the photograph was more believable at that point. It could be useful in society to make things change, sometimes for the better. And similarly, in 2015, 10 years ago, when a 2-year-old boy drowned with members of his family trying to escape Syria, it caused change in the world. A lot more money was collected for refugees, and some countries let in more refugees. To me, this may be the last iconic photograph to change the world in a better way, because we no longer have the systems of press, the systems of credible, believable photography as we did before. So this was 10 years ago. So this was the impact, or part of the impact, of that photograph around the world. There's several versions of the photograph I meant. So what sometimes photographers are doing now is inventing new ways of having impact. This was older men and women who used to be soldiers in Massachusetts in the United States, who died in a nursing home, about 60 of them from COVID. And so to celebrate their lives, an Associated Press photographer, David Goldman, projected a photograph of them when they were young on the homes of their family members as a way of celebrating who they were, remembering them. And instead of having a front page of a newspaper, he used the sides of houses as a way to have an impact. This is part of the way that many, many photographers around the world are reinventing the medium to have an impact in the different era in which we live now. So again, the cover of my book was for several years I've been experimenting writing text prompts to generate images using different artificial intelligence systems. And a lot of the work I'm doing is not to compete with photography, to simulate the photorealistic image, but for example, this is, an attempt to depict romantic Martians. Obviously, nobody has photographed Martians. Nobody has met Martians, but it's more of fantasy instead of an attempt to compete with the real. And again, doing it from the point of view from a writer who's not alive, who wrote War of the Worlds about the invasion of Martians. So this is the idea in digital media. Once something is in code, you could output it in any medium you want. So you could output a painting as music, or you could output music as a photograph, or as writing. Once it's in code, it's what we call transmedia, not multimedia, but transmedia. So you could depict it in different media. In this case, I'm using a writer's work to depict it as image. So this is one of the AI images that I made. I asked, as you can see, it says the prompt was the first photograph ever made. And this is one of the images that it came up with. I always try to write under it or next to it, this is a synthetic image, not a photograph. In this case, generated by Dream Studio, which is an artificial intelligence system, in response to the text prompt above by me in August 2023. So the text prompt was the first photograph ever made, and this is what was generated, one of the images. And this is another version, the first photograph ever made at the same time, that was generated also by Dream Studio. And to me, this reminds me very much of Roland Barthes when he writes about looking in the eyes of the brother who looked at Napoleon. This reminds me of that idea. As we know, artificial intelligence systems scrape billions of images online, the keywords and captions, and they learn how they're constructed, and then they construct new images. So just to make one important point, we went from what I consider to be optical photography in the 20th century, 19th century. The light goes through the lens and records on film. Then we went to computational photography. The algorithms in the camera or the software post-production, such as Photoshop, modify the light that's gone through the lens to change it, to manipulate it, to enhance it, whatever the term, make people thinner, make people look different flesh tones, whatever, different backgrounds. And after computational photography, where we modified the light going through the lens, we don't even need a lens or a camera in artificial intelligence. You just simulate the photorealistic imagery with no camera and no lens. So there's a transition, a kind of sequence going from optical photography to computational photography, and now to AI. And one question is computational photography still photography or just another form of imaging? And certainly now with artificial intelligence, I use the term synthetic image. I never use the term photograph because these are not photographs. So now I will just show you about a dozen AI images with the idea also that more and more the search engines offer to make the image instead of to find the image. So they'll make it for you eventually more and more. And so the question then is, that one can reconfigure history any way one wants. So this was a recent one. This month, I asked the Great Wall of China during the Ming Dynasty, and this is one of the images that it came up with. And one of the obvious problems is we had no photography during the Ming Dynasty, and so it's very difficult then to confirm whether this is what it might have looked like or not. These become potential histories, possible histories, not actual recordings of the visible. So similarly, this is 1815, a photograph of a street scene in Berlin. This is the prompt that I asked the AI system. In 1815, there were no automobiles, there were no photographs, but for the AI system, that's not a problem. History itself is something that can be fabricated without any guidelines as to what actually happened. You could often just make it up, which then affects all of us in terms of our reference points, in terms of both the present and the past, and affects the future. So this is the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, taking a selfie. Obviously, in the 1860s, there were no cell phones, but again, for the artificial intelligence system, in this case, DALL-E, it was just possible to make it up. If somebody is a young person in school doing a research paper, they may not know that. And so history becomes what one wants it to be, as opposed to what actually might have happened. We know, nonfiction is not always nonfiction, but this is completely made up. And this is the President of the United States as if photographed by a child. Again, what I do with AI is I want to see the perspective, how it interprets what a child might see, maybe what an animal would see. This idea that AI can do things differently than photography and give you some ideas as to what different points of view might look like. Most of these images I'm showing now are in my new book, The Synthetic Eye. So again, this is Romantic Martians in Love. In this case, I wanted to be inspired by the work of the novelist Virginia Woolf. Again, she was not a photographer, but I wanted to see how the AI would interpret, based upon her writing, how she might construct an image, which gets at the idea that all photographs are constructs. It's the way that society, or one of the ways that society represents the real. It is not, again, the truth or the absolute reality, but it's a construct. So in some ways, working with AI, it's a commentary and a way of understanding what the photograph actually does by comparing it. I asked for an iconic photograph from the year 1945. This is what it gave me. Again, sometimes I find that the AI systems I've worked with have a sense of the surreal rather than the real. They have a sense of humor, even, one might say. And sometimes I'm astonished, I'm surprised by what they come up with. When I was a picture editor of the New York Times Magazine and other publications, when I assigned a photographer, I often had a good sense of what kind of image they would come back with. For example, a writer, they would often show the person behind a desk with books, a typewriter at that time. But with AI, this was a surprise. I had no idea that this is what it would think. This is an iconic photograph from the year 1945. It was a big surprise. And this was, I asked for a photograph of the perfect family. And again, I was surprised that this is what the AI system considered a perfect family. No women as mother. And it again, AI systems are often criticized for being racist, for being misogynistic, in large part because the images that they train on, that they learn from online, are often racist, misogynistic, and so on. But sometimes the AI system seems liberated with new ideas or different ideas from the conventional ideas. This is not what I expected, but I was very happy to see it. And this was a photograph of a street scene in Harlem, in New York City, in the style of a 20th century jazz musician. So a lot of the great musicians of jazz come from Harlem. So I wanted to see how the AI would interpret the point of view of a jazz musician on Harlem. And I find it really interesting, the sense of distortion, of rhythm, of possibility. It's not just a concrete image, but it seems alive in certain ways, a little bit like a visual interpretation of jazz. So some of the most interesting AI images are not photorealistic, but somewhat distorted, which can be quite interesting. So I asked for a photo of the Olympic table tennis champion in 2045. So often I experiment with how AI sees the future. Who's going to win the table tennis championship 20 years from now? And this is one of its responses. Obviously, again, photography cannot photograph the future, but AI can depict a possible future, which, for example, in the case of climate change, if it shows what Beijing or New York or Paris would look like in 20 years, if we don't do anything about climate change, it could be good because maybe we will do something to protect ourselves because the AI is showing a possible future. So this is one possible future. So again, this was the prompt, a photograph of a soldier in the Vietnam War taking a selfie. And this is what the image that came out of it. The one on the right is the back cover of my new book. And again, it's the issue in the Vietnam War. There were no selfies. There were no cell phones, but the AI system did not have a problem with making one for me. And this was the victory parade in New York after the Vietnam War ended. There was no victory parade at all. The soldiers came back. Often people were not very nice to them because they were against the war. But you can make these images, and I find more and more, as somebody who's spent now 50 years in the field, I have trouble knowing whether something is an actual photograph or an AI photorealistic image. It's more and more difficult to tell them apart. And so this is just to finish this part of the talk, but when some of the systems I'm using, you put in a prompt, they show you 4 images possible. So the prompt here is the after image. What do you see after the image? So these were 4 possibilities that it gave me, which I thought were very poetic and eloquent interpretation of the after image. So I've been working on a project called Strips. It's like an old-fashioned contact sheet in photography in which you have choices among the images and you select the ones you want to make bigger and to use and so on. So this is the after image. And one important point is if I put in the same prompt the next day, I normally get very different images. It's just like photography. If you don't make the picture at a certain time, you cannot make it in the future. So the same thing with artificial intelligence, the same prompt. For example, here it's a photograph of peace. This is what I got. but I wouldn't get it again with the same prompt. There's a spelling mistake. There's a T at the end. It's not supposed to be there. Yeah, and then it also makes you ask questions. Why does the girl on the left, why are her fingers that way? What does that have to do with peace? Why did it choose the other images? What does it really mean? So much of the time I'm doing this, I'm asking questions. What is the artificial intelligence telling me or telling us by the images it chooses? Because sometimes I'm not sure I understand what it's getting at, what it's trying to say. So here the prompt was a sexist photograph, presumably a photograph against women. And this is, again, what it came up with. And, also I find it really interesting to try to figure out what it means by these different images and if they can be taken seriously at that time. How does one interpret them? And then sometimes it's surprising. I asked several years ago for the most alarming photograph of climate change today. And within seconds, this is what it came up with, a diptych. I did not ask for a diptych, the two images. And so you have a clock saying it's urgent. You have the oil geyser, the polar bear, the ice melting, the sun. And again, a single photograph cannot do this. And I found it interesting that the AI created a complex image to say that climate change is not one thing, but it's multiple issues at the same time. And then here I asked for an ethical photograph of a homeless person by a homeless photographer, because I wanted to see if it would be different, the image, than one made by a photographer who is not homeless. And what I noticed here was that the man seems happier, more alert, more alive, staring the photographer in the eyes. He wasn't a stereotype that was sad of somebody who's victimized, but he seemed just like a regular human being who can be happy, who could be warm, who could have ideas, who's alert, who's intelligent, but he does not have a home. So I found there was a difference than many of the stereotypes that we see of people who are homeless. So this I asked, it's a question I've forever. Is there a photograph of war's horror that would stop all wars? That's the dream of many photographers working in war situations. Can I make a photograph to stop all wars? And this is what it came up with, which it does not show the spectacle of the violence, but instead it shows its impact on the spectator, on the observer, both the little girl, who's presumably the daughter of the photographer, and also the fact that somehow it's so horrible, it crushes the camera. So we have to imagine the war. We have to imagine the violence, the destruction, the hurt, and the pain. We're not a voyeur looking at it, but we're actually all then responsible as spectators. And I think what the AI is doing, which I did not expect, is not showing the violence itself, but is showing its impact on us and, by implication, our responsibility as citizens of the world to make sure there are no wars. Okay, there's only a few images left now in this part. The most beautiful woman in the world. I did not expect this. This is not like the cover of a fashion magazine or a, super elegance and so on. It's a more ordinary looking woman. And I was happily surprised that this is what the AI came up with instead of what might be a cover for a glamour or a fashion magazine. And this image was done almost 3 years ago. And when I work with it more recently, AI systems, I find the images that they create often are more conventional now, exceptional. In other words, that they They make images more like what you would expect, as if they're trying to please you in a mainstream way, as opposed to showing things from a different perspective. It's more conventional at this point, generally, not always, but often. So this is a pictorialist photograph of two Martians was the prompt. You know, pictorialism was photography, particularly in the 19th century, imitating the look of painting. So I wanted to see how it would interpret that. And I found that the image was very surrealistic. Again, I didn't expect it, but I find it really interesting the way that the AI made a leap and interpreted my. And I've made many, many images with the prompt about Martians, again, because there's no photography, and I just wanted to see how the AI would interpret my prompts about things that have not been photographed, such as Martians. Okay, so now I think I have 3 images left to show here. A photograph of the greatest mothers in the world. I expected it would come up with human beings, with women, but instead it's animals. And again, I was surprised, and I realized that how narrow my idea was when I asked for greatest mothers, how narrow my thinking was to expect that it would inevitably be human beings, when of course all kinds of animals may be great mothers. And this was a photograph of an unhappy bot, you know, the software program, the repetitive program. Again, I thought that a machine might understand machines better. So I have a series of images of how AI would depict bots, algorithms, and so on, to have its insight into what, in this case, an unhappy software program might look like. And the last one in this section, obviously one cannot photograph what one sees after one dies. So I asked the AI to show it. And again, I have a series of images of what one might see after one's death. And for me, I found it very comforting, because I began to think of all biological organisms, plants, animals, people, insects dying. One does not die alone. One dies as part of a universe of life that eventually dies. And so this is one of the experiments. Another experiment I've been doing is to try to see how AI shows what cannot be photographed, in this case, what one first sees after one's death. So that's the end of part 1. And so these are some images I generate just for, in this case, countries that have had no women president, or the second Black president of the United States. I just generate them to provoke a discussion. And this is a friend of mine from Vogue magazine. She asked me to do a prompt self-portrait in this, as an older woman, in the style of Cindy Sherman. So again, there's an ethical question here. We know Cindy Sherman is famous for her self-portraits. This is another one that was generated, that I generated. This is another one I generated. And the question becomes, is this correct to do this? Is it, as you know, a self-portrait as an older woman in the style of Cindy Sherman? Is it ethical to use somebody's style? Some artists say no. You know, I've encountered also the idea that it's good, because you're actually acknowledging, respecting, and celebrating the artist you're following in. And you know, the same idea, like a Stephen Shore photograph. Stephen Shore asked the AI to generate an image like his own image, his own photograph. He put it on Instagram, and I interviewed Stephen Shore. And I said, were you happy with it? And he said, yes, it had his own wry sense of humor. except he would have done it in with a large format camera with more detail. So it also raises then the possibility that an artist, after their own death, for example, if they approve the algorithm, could still keep making images, or their estate can do the same thing. So this is an example about just a week or two ago, I just made a series of self-portraits using AI. The top second from the right is me as a Chinese diplomat. The bottom second from the left is me from the point of view of a fly, of an insect. And you'll see that these are more images, again, self-portrait series. And the first one that I made, it's all based on this photograph of me, which I entered into the artificial intelligence system to see how it would interpret it with different prompts. But these are the very, many more, but or some more, but these are some of the interpretations. So now I'll talk about some of the big issues. Samsung argues recently with AI, there is no such thing as a real picture. Adobe says AI is the new digital camera. So in other words, the big technical companies, Google is saying now that if your memory of the past is different than what the photograph shows, you should be able to change it. And at the bottom in the Washington Post, Jeffrey Feller wrote, think of your camera less as a reflection of reality and more as an AI trying to make you happy. So these are 4 comments on the impact of artificial intelligence. No such thing as a real picture. AI is the new digital camera. Google saying you should change the photograph to make it match your memory. And Fowler saying now the camera is less a reflection of reality and more an AI trying to make you happy. These are the big issues, and this is how tech companies are viewing it. So this is also, they've done studies that people cannot tell AI synthesized faces from real faces, but not only that, they find them more trustworthy, believable, the AI images of people, not the photographs. They find the AI images of people who do not exist more trustworthy than the photographs of actual people. So one of the issues that is more addressed is deepfakes, that's putting somebody's image, usually in a video that's often pornographic, and the people are victimized. It's almost always women, it's often celebrities, but it's also now happening in schools for children, where there's been cases where boys have used what they call nudify software and take the faces of the girls, like a 12-year-old girl in the class, and make her body look nude using AI, and it causes enormous trauma to the people to whom it's done. And so that's the one part, particularly in Europe, the United States, that is attracting more attention to do something about, even though it still continues. And also, perhaps the worst of it all is the enormous number of images of child pornography being made using AI, sometimes deep fakes using an actual photograph of a child's face, but you can make enormous numbers of AI generated images of child pornography, which is horrible. And I know that in China, the government has different regulations than in some other countries, but the problem is global. It's everywhere, because if people could create such imagery, fabricate such imagery in one country, it could be seen in other countries. And my sense is in the United Nations and in different global organizations have to work together. The countries have to work together to try to limit the damage and increase the more constructive, positive uses of AI. So, for example, Adobe, which created Photoshop, and on their stock, they also sell images for reproduction, which people pay for, companies pay for. So they feature an AI generated photo. It is not a photo. If it's AI generated, it is not a photo. It's an image, but not a photo, of a Palestinian refugee. And again, you could sit in your living room or your office anywhere in the world and make these images about other people without going there. With photography, you had to go there with your camera. Now you don't. And the irony is that Adobe is leading the Content Authenticity Initiative, which tracks changes that it made in an image, use of Photoshop to modify the image. So at the same time, they're in charge of or spearheading the Content Authenticity Initiative. They're making these images. They're selling these images, AI-generated images. These are from Ukraine. These people do not exist, but were made by AI and are sold by Adobe, the same company that is leading the effort for credibility. So at the same time, what I showed you before, the companies, billion-dollar companies talking about AI, there are efforts, this is from Chicago, to create software to either protect a artist's images from being scraped, scanned, used, generally without permission. And there's even software that is created to then distort the AI to make it less effective. But these are small efforts by groups of artists to protect their images from being scanned and scraped and used by these these very, very wealthy companies to train their AI systems, to protect it, artists trying to protect their own work. One of them is called Nightshade here that's being shown. So this is another example. These are the famous photographs by Robert Capa, World War II, the invasion on D-Day here, that they're iconic. But Philip Toledano has now made AI images of what Robert Capa might have photographed on other rolls of film if he actually used them. So this is just in the last couple of months, but it's taking the actual photographs of Capa, which are history and very important, and making AI images that Capa might have made, looking like photographs that Capa might have made. So he's playing with history. These are all AI images. And then this is a Magnum photographer, Carl de Keyser, who's been a member of Magnum Photos for many, many years. And instead of going to Russia recently, he self-published, I think in December, a few months ago, Putin's Dream of Russia Today without going there. So these are all AI-generated images that he made of Russia today without going there. So Magnum Photos, which has existed since 1947, witnessing and depicting history, had a big decision. What do they do about it? He's a member. So they decided members can do what they want, but they're not going to put these images in their archive because they're not photographs. So that's the decision they made. These images cannot go into the archive of Magnum. It's not history, it's AI. Okay, so these are some of the issues. There are many, many uses of AI now in newspapers, magazines. Sometimes they're called photographs, sometimes AI. And if we had time, I could show you many, many more uses for good and for bad. In one case in Australia, refugees who were abused, there were no cameras, no photographs made, but with AI, they were able to generate images to show the abuse. So that was better use, but there are many, many more issues, but I'm going to move to part 3. So part 3 is about 3 ideas for ensuring photographic credibility. What do we do about it? So one idea, which I've had for quite a long time, is to think of a journalistic photograph as a quotation from appearances, the John Berger idea. And just like in writing, if you quote somebody's speech or what they've written, you cannot change the words without telling the reader. Just think of a photograph as something, what's inside the frame of the photograph is like inside quotation marks, and you cannot change it without telling the reader. That's a very simple idea, but then if we say that's a journalistic photograph, everybody knows that nothing in it has been changed. It's all a recording of the visible, unless you tell the reader. So that's first idea. The only thing you can do is just slight change the contrast. You could crop the image, and you could clean up the digital noise. Anything beyond these changes, the reader must be informed. So, for example, you could also use labels. This is a heavily manipulated photograph on the left, and not a lens icon. And this is an AI image on the right that I generated. And you could use labels to indicate it as well. So I helped found the Writing with Light movement. Photography means, and photo is light, and graphy is writing or drawing. So Writing with Light. You see the website there, www.light.org. And one of our, if you go to it, you'll see much of what I'm saying right now as a manifesto we just published last week. But we treat the writer, the photographer, as the author of the image, like a writer is author of the words. In other words, you cannot trust the camera anymore to be a recording of the visible, because it's many times it's not, but you can trust the author of the image, the photographer, to be a person of integrity. Just like you don't trust words just because they're words, you trust the writer, the author. The idea here is to trust the photographer, not the camera. And we also defined at the bottom paragraph what is nonfiction photography. So we defined it as a recording of the visible, in which the photographer strives to represent actualities, events, people, etc., in a fair and accurate manner with appropriate context. So when I was curating an exhibition of Magnum photographs, it was 400 photographs over 40 years. And I realized that with the shutter speed being about 1/100th of a second, 400 photographs amounted to only 4 seconds of history, 1 second for every 10 years that we were showing. So I realized how little that is, and how important then context is, captions, different kinds of context for the photograph, which only represents a fraction of a second. These are the statement of principles, but you can find them on www.light.org, the website, which we created a couple of years ago, so we won't go into them now. But this is meant to be an international movement to increase credibility of the photograph, the journalistic and documentary photograph. The assumption is that artists can do anything they want with photographs, but as representations of actual events and people, journalistic and documentary work, we need to be transparent, clear, honest, and authentic. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to show, the third idea, is an idea I had in 2004, 21 years ago, when I gave the keynote speech at World Press Photo in Amsterdam, the Four Corners Project. And it's the idea that every corner of the photograph itself online can contain certain kinds of information. It's a project to increase authorship and credibility in visual media. So this is how it works. The bottom right corner You record authorship, so the caption, the credit, the copyright, or Creative Commons, the photographer's code of ethics, a link to agencies or the website. The bottom left is the backstory, what was going on while one was making the photograph. The upper left is related imagery. It could be video, photography, the same event from different perspectives. And the upper right is links to websites that give more information. So I'll show you how it works. So the bottom right corner would be the photographer's credit, their name, their caption, copyright, and I wrote the code of ethics for this photographer just to show the idea, which says that while photography is interpretive, as a photojournalist, my photographs are meant to respect the visible facts of the situation I depict. I do not add or subtract elements to or from my photographs. In the bottom left would be the backstory. So in this case, I quoted the photographer saying that she had seen, unfortunately, many dead bodies, but seeing this Alan Kurdi's body, the 2-year-old boy, it gave her nightmares, it made her feel horrible, but she's happy that she was able to change the way we look at immigration in Europe and that no more people have to die on their way out of a war. In the upper left would be related imagery. So in this case, it's the boy himself, Alan Kurdi, and his brother. When they're alive, both of them unfortunately died. But again, you could use related imagery to give more context. So the upper right would be links to other websites describing more issues around it, including in this case, why Human Rights Watch felt it was okay to publish a photograph of a child who died when they don't usually do that. So these are the different corners on the website, fourcornersproject.org. You could see it, you can make your own. And this is like codes of ethics that I wrote. I'm a fashion photographer. I don't work with underweight models, or I'm an artist. I can do anything I want, and so on. So the idea is that people write, which I encourage everybody to do. You could write your own code of ethics in 1 or 2 sentences on your website so people know what strategy you use as a photographer. And by the way, if you go to the website, it's in about 8 or 10 languages, including Chinese. Okay, so just to finish, this is the US invasion of Haiti. But if you use the 4 corners, this is what it looked like from the side, which is very different than just looking at this photograph. Again, this is how it works. So for example, young African-American men and women in the United States were afraid that sometimes when they're killed by police, that the gangster image is shown. So it allows you to actually show another image of the same person, that people can be shown in many different ways. It's not just one way to be shown. So the 4 corners allows many perspectives on the same person. Okay, so just to finish, if you're interested, I have a website, thefifthcorner.org, with many of these ideas you're free to look at. And I also have on social media a Substack, which I write 1 or 2 times a week with many of these ideas too. So you're welcome to visit either or both of those if you'd like to. Thank you.
Let's invite the 战车 to proceed.
非常感谢李钦先生刚才做了一个非常精彩的讲座，对，这个我听了之后也是非常的受益。而且李钦先生呢，在最早的时候呢，回顾了一下这个 Photoshop 和这个 AI 来临之前那些个造假的照片。这个让我呢也想到了这个，我以前看过一个展览，那个展览完全是用传统手法，用那个拼贴呀和涂抹呀，用暗房那种技术做的各种的假的新闻照片，我觉得也是非常有意思的。那么造假呢，它实际上我们说今天进入了这个AI 时代，实际也只能说它的这个造假的手段。它有了一个从量到质的一个非常大的变化， 但是那个造假的这种驱动，实际是很早就有的。那个李钦先生呢，在后面的这个讲座里呢，举了很多的例子。这个例子呢，也恰恰是我，因为我对这个 AI 的这个影像，我也是有很长时间的一个深入思考的。其中恰恰有一点呢，这个也是非常有意思的，就是那个指令和召唤出来的那个影像。实际它再现了我们以往传统照片与语言之间的那种既互补又断裂的张力关系的。就说你发出一个指令，实际上恰恰你是不能够完全预感到那个照片给你回应的那个 AI 给你生成的是什么样子的。这个也恰恰是我在思考 AI 影像的时候一个非常重要的一个切入点。对，一会儿后面我会讲。然后呢，我又想到了一个临时想到一个特别有趣的问题啊。正好我也看了这个迈克尔·弗雷泽的一篇文章，他就讲他是分析那个罗兰巴特那个明示的。那么他就讲，他说他讲到了次点啊，那个照片的次点。他说这个 AI 的合成影像将不再有次点，因为它的指示性已经消失，它不再只是那个现实的那个对象了。那么我觉得呢，他说的既有道理，但是呢，肯定是有道理。但是我不认为，但我并不这么下结论，因为我想这个问题可能更复杂。对，所以呢，一会儿我先不讲，一会儿我后面我会讲。为什么呢？合成影像它的次点不再是指向了那个现实中的某个物、某个细节、某个情境，但我认为它指向了梦。我们梦有没有次点？对，就说这个我们虚构的东西里面是不是也有？比如说我刚才在李钦先生的那个照片里，我就看到了 AI 对他指令所回复的东西让我们很惊讶的地方。我甚至都能从某些照片里看到了那个所谓次点，就是象征界破裂，外界的黑洞敞开。对，我也能看到这个东西。所以说，AI 合成影像确实指向不了一个现实的那个现有的存在物，但是它仍然可以指向那个梦的次点。一会儿我会详细的说我。
I agree with your point on the punctum. I agree completely. But I would also go back and say the photograph is not reality. The photograph is a representation of an interpretation of the real. It's not reality itself. So the photograph is often part fantasy as well. But the AI, it's sometimes a novel is more real than a newspaper article. A fiction is more real than the nonfiction. So I think in some ways that the AI can be more real than the photograph itself, even though it's not a recording of the visible. So I take your point. I think that people misunderstand AI images. They see it as the lowest common denominator. I'd say 95% of what you see online is trivial. It's not interesting with AI. A little bit, what I've been doing is trying to push the boundary with AI. And I think you're absolutely right about scale. It's what Marshall McLuhan also referenced. It's a difference in scale. There have always been manipulations. There's always been distortions. There's always been, intentional or unintentional distortion. But now the scale is so large that, I've been writing magazine articles and so on to the point where I think the fake has become more important than the real, if you want to use that as a shorthand. In other words, the AI generated image, the video, the photo, the simulated photo has more social currency, the fake, the fabrication, than the depiction of the visible. The depiction of the visible is too ordinary, it's trivial to people, they don't believe it, it doesn't have credibility, and more, we're seeing that what dominates media now is the AI, the fabrication, the intentional fake, so that the intentional, it's like Umberto Eco travels in hyperreality, it's that the fake becomes more real than the real. So but I agree with your point.
我们现在呢，先有请这个陈国森博士啊，对这个李钦刚才的这个讲座啊，给予一个回应。好，有请这个国森。
Okay, so thank you to Zhang for moderating, and thank you to Fred Ritchin very much for your presentation. It was very detailed and gave me a lot of inspiration. So I'll take about 8 to 10 minutes to respond to your talk, and I'll end by asking my question. So, there's actually a lot more I'd like to discuss with you on this topic than what I'll be able to say in a moment, if you don't mind. So I'd like to approach the issue of authenticity in AI-generated images from another respect, because I think you've really used some thorough and convincing evidence to show that in the history of photography's relationship to truth, also as well as in the history of photographic truth events, there's actually much more continuity than we usually think. So not that there's a break or a rupture from analog to detail and then another rupture from detail to AIGC. Photographs, of course, have never automatically possessed evidentiary power. So even when the content of an image doesn't come directly from reality, like it does in traditional documentary photography. So the effects it produces, I think, can still feel incredibly real, as you guys just mentioned. Yeah, so sometimes become even more authentic. So I think this definitely makes things a lot more complicated. Just calling AI just images is fake, I think it doesn't get us very far. As we've seen from the impact of deepfakes and similar cases, just like you showed us, even though we all know these images are fake, they are AI generated, they can still cause very real harm, very real consequences for the people involved. So because our visual experience is shaped by a long tradition, and as Bowiger pointed out, nothing has been more regulated, nothing has been more shaped by conventions than photography. So, but these conventions, I think, don't just come from art history, don't just come from the history of photography or any tradition of iconography. They are rooted in the broader social reality. They are rooted in the, in your terms, the shared reality we all live in. What it means is that even when we are able to identify the traces of AI-generated images, we can't simply deny the kinds of political, the kinds of personal or emotional projections that these images invite. And the authenticity of these projections, in many ways, cannot just be dismissed. So that's exactly what the truth effect of AI-generated images is, something that deserves serious attention and analysis. I think these images are very well known, because I think a recent case really illustrates this. During the papal election, Donald Trump posted an image on X that used AIGC to show himself, something like this, dressed as Pope. So everyone knew it was fake, but that didn't cancel out the political and religious effects that the images produced. So there's another related fact I should mention, and it might not have much to do with politics right now, because there's a really popular trend on Chinese social media for generating images. The prompts for this particular images specifically ask AI to create something like low quality, something like imperfect or blurry photos. And ironically, the photos produced in this way end up looking very realistic. And we'll see all sorts of impossible images, which means the images is something like a photo of Hitler and Stalin posing together in front of Shanghai's Oriental Pearl Tower, or a selfie of Bach preparing for a concert, or a photo of, for example, some Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt posing on the Westbound in Shanghai. Something obvious, both of them are fake, but people still enjoy making and sharing them. So this brings me to a new question. How should we view the relationship between AI-generated images and political operations today? Like something I mentioned earlier, the fake photo of Donald Trump at the Pope. I think it might be a very typical example, although I'm not very familiar with the details of American politics. But similarly, there are situations where official news media in China, they use AI-generated images to shape the identity of a particular group. So there's no doubt these were AI generated, but so the question is, how should we think about these images? The photos that everyone can instantly recognize as AI generated, but that still perform some kind of real political function. So that's what I like to ask. Yeah. So thank you.
Oh, thank you for your comments. You're absolutely right. It's when I wrote the book in 1990, it was called In Our Own Image, The Coming Revolution of Photography, that all these digital software would allow us to remake the world the way we want it to be, not the way it is. In part, I see it as consumer capitalism. When you're a consumer, you want to get what you want, and it's almost like you're a minor deity, a minor god. And the economic and social structure is set up to at least pretend to give you what you want, so that AI allows you to remake the world in your own image, the way you want it to be, not the way it is. And so that becomes a kind of a minor victory, with all the difficulties of life and all the difficulties of in different societies. It gives one a way to say, I get it my way. The world is my way. And then finally, at this point, with all the difficulties and challenges and complexities, you have people like Trump just bypassing photography and saying the fake is more important than the real, and the fake is where the power is. He doesn't have to anymore conform to the real. He could make up his own reality, and he becomes, in that sense, a demagogue. And I think that's what we're seeing more and more, is the growth of demagogues in many societies, in which AI expedites, allows, and supports their vision and shows it. And actually, I did a column on Friday on my Substack. I asked the AI which photographs would best question the wisdom of the Trump administration, which would be the best to show that it's not doing a good job. And the AI ChatGPT responded to me in 3 images. 2 of them were AI, the Pope one you just mentioned, and one of him is king, and then a 3rd image where his official portrait imitates his mugshot. And what struck me is that the AI did not say a photograph of Gaza, a photograph of Ukraine, a photograph of hunger, a photograph of disease. Nothing was photographs of the world. Everything was about the fake. And the fake has more power than the real. And that's the enormous fear. And what you're raising is really what if we had one more hour to talk about, you're raising the really important issues right now. How do we deal with that? Because the media ecosystem has remarkably changed. It's not just AI against photography. It's really the real, the authentic versus the fabricated and fake. And that's where we're at. And that's the danger and the challenge that worldwide we're facing at this point. The whole media ecosystem is changing very rapidly, in which the AI is replacing the photograph. So if I want to see, China in 1830, or I want to see Paris in 1920, it'll make the image for me the way I want it. It's kind of a fast food restaurant. What do you want? You want extra pickles? You want extra ketchup? Do you want this? You get it. And that's what AI does. You get the world the way you want it to be. And the demagogues are using that to increase their power. So it's a massive set of issues. You're right. But we need another hour or two to discuss it.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, thank you.
Just one sentence, an easy way to say it is we go from self-portrait to selfie to avatar.
Fred, if possible, can I ask you two quick questions before you leave? Just very brief question. You can even answer yes or no.
Go ahead.
My question is really about whether AI is photography or not, because I remember like more than 10 years ago when I interviewed you, and you said that digital photography was a paradigm shift, and you called it after photography or super photography or photography 2.0, as many people call it, called the digital photography. So now we have AI generated image, even though we know that that's not exactly photography. But since photography is so malleable, do you think that we can call it photography 3.0, or it is also kind of a photography?
No, I think it's a different medium. It's not photography. It's a paradigm shift. It's a different medium. So we cannot. It's a longer answer, but we went, computational photography I talked about. We could argue, is that photography or is that just image? But certainly AI generated imagery is not photography. It sometimes looks like it. It sometimes looks like painting. It sometimes sounds like music. But, in terms of being photography, it's not. So what's the second question?
The second question is that you showed us AI generated photos of the past and also of the future, but I think AI is it is very difficult for AI to generate images of the immediate experiences of the human being. So that's why I think whatever AI, at least so far, can generate, it will not really be as real as documentary photography that have been created by human photographers. Do you agree with this statement or not?
No, because I think you're being idealistic and hopeful. The self-portraits I showed you of me, I did last week. You could do whatever you want. You could simulate photographs I've done of the Ukraine war, I've done of Gaza, and so on. So the realism of the AI is so high now that often if you show me 10 images and ask me, is this AI or photograph, I'll usually get about 7 correct. And I have 50 years experience in a field. So no, I think it does present, it does future, it does past, but I don't think that's what it is going to do. I think it's going to do much more important things, which are not to simulate photographs, but to investigate planets that we don't know about, to investigate things at a microscopic level, to investigate history thousands of years ago. it's going to be interesting as an investigating tool, doing things outside the parameters of photography. And, we're just at the beginning of it. The beginning of it is like the beginning of photography. It repeated painting in many ways, and I think the beginning of AI, and in many ways, we're using it to repeat photography. But in the years to come, it's going to become a much bigger, larger, more complex, nuanced medium, and helping us understand ourselves in different ways. For example, AI, you could depict your dreams, you could depict nightmares. You cannot do that with photography. So you could put in the prompt, I dreamt about whatever. Somebody traumatized, a child could do the same. You could make images so that AI could be really interesting with the unconscious as well. So, I think there's much more to do. If we had another 2 hours, and I'm happy to come back, there's many, many more things to discuss that we just began. Today was to lay the groundwork, for a bunch of ideas, but there are many, many more issues to go on. But I thank you very much, and I was very happy to speak with you all, and I hope it was useful. And again, you can reach me by email, and I'm happy to come back at some point as well. And ideally, one day I come to China and we do it in person.
Yes, that's what I was thinking, that to bring you to China and to speak to us in person. But thank you very much, Fred, for your time.
Yeah, thank you
your
for
presentation.
thank you for your interpretation.
实际现在这个讨论才进入到这个更烧脑的阶段，是吧？这个下面呢，这个我先请姜蓉老师，把你的那个 PPT 简单的分享一下，然后呢，我再把我今天准备的我的这些年的思考的一个观点也分享一下。这样的话呢，从更多元的思路和更深层的这方面，对今天李钦先生的这个讲座呢，以及我们这个讨论和思考，做一个更加全面的回应。好，那个姜蓉老师，请。
好，我呢就是想针对刚才李青啊、的演讲呢，来跟大家分享一下，就是其实，在上个世纪80年代的时候捷克裔的这个巴西后来移居到巴西的哲学家维莱姆博卢瑟呢，他曾经出过2本书。第一本书呢是关于他出过2本书，一本是1983年的时候写了一本书，英文叫做《Towards a Philosophy of Photography》，国内好像已经有译本了，然后中文应该是翻译成《摄影哲学的思考》。他这本书里呢，主要是以摄影作为起点来分析摄影这个相机作为一个装置它称为装置的就是实际上就是器材了，作为器材作为装置的这么一个逻辑的起点来谈一下，就是他对摄影的一些哲学的思考。那么他更重要的一个专著呢，实际上是在1985年以德文出版的这本书2011年才出了中文版。那咱们国内呢，其实已经有复旦大学出版社有了这个中文的译本，翻成是技术影像的宇宙。其实我觉得更准确的译法应该是朝向或者进入，对，应该是进入技术影像的宇宙。这本书呢，它更系统的讲了一下，就是他提出了这个概念，叫做技术影像。在什么叫技术影像呢？就根据这个弗卢瑟的定义，就是它是跟传统影像，你请注意它是用 image 它不是用 picture，就是跟这个绘画他认为是传统影像，因为他说在5000多年以前洞穴人类就开始有这个绘画，然后后来慢慢有了语言以后，语言开始成为人们交流的一个主要的媒介。那么呢，到后来才开始有了这个摄影。那摄影出来以后呢， 再后来就有了数码，是吧？数码摄影就是刚才李青说的，刚开始是光学摄影，第二步呢是这个计算摄影，也就是通过这个数字来合成的这个影像，那是数码摄影。到现在呢，我们已经可以不用镜头，不用相机，用 AI 软件就能合成影像。所以呢，他认为在80年代那个时候已经有电脑合成的影像。因此呢，他认为凡是用数码相机或者是像电脑，那个时候数码相机还没出来啊，数码相机是89年出来的，商业生产。当然，在那个之前，人类已经有这个第一个用数码合成的影像，包括电脑合成的影像，它都统称为技术影像啊，不是技术图像，叫做 technical images。那么，什么叫做技术影像呢？技术影像，他认为是从这个装置，像相机和计算机这种装置里边的软件，通过计算，然后抽象出来的一些影像。这种影像往往是由颗粒拼成的这个镶嵌画，比方说像像素啊等等，来使得现实模型化，而不是直接再现现实。光学的这个影像，用这个底片和镜头拍摄的那个是直接再现现实，但是到了数码影像的时候，其实它已经是一个计算机的这个抽象出来的这个影像。所以呢，这个都叫做技术影像，它跟传统的影像，就是绘画还有这个文本已经区别开来了。那么福禄瑟就认为呢，人类今后会越来越多的，用这个技术影像来交流，而不是用文字来交流了。那么这种情况呢，就会产生出一个什么样的特征呢？它就是说，技术影像的特征是，它不是像传统影像那样是对这个外部世界的一些事物的观察所产生的结果啊。技术影像呢，它是一个对于这种不同概念的一种计算的结果啊，它是通过内部的一些电脑程序来计算，用算法来产生出一些影像啊。这种影像呢，跟外部世界呢是没有直接的关联，虽然它看上去好像是来自外部世界。所以呢，我觉得从这一点来说，可能就可以印证了李青刚才的回答，也就是说，AI 生成的影像它不能算作摄影，为什么呢？因为摄影最重要的一个特征就是它跟现实世界是有直接的关联，这个是摄影媒介跟绘画媒介和其他媒介最大的一个区别，是吧？跟现实世界有个直接的关联性。而 AI 影像它并没有直接的关联，它不是直接在线，虽然它看上去很像，或者说今后也有可能模仿的很像，直接来自于现实世界，但这个已经是一个新的媒介了。所以呢，其实福禄瑟呢，他是一个预言家，是哲学家，往往很多是一个预言家，他不仅能够总结现实世界中的一些规律，同时呢，他也能预测，这就是哲学家的伟大之处。那实际上，福禄瑟呢，当时他就提出来，就是相对于传统影像来说呢，相对于文本来说，文本是一种线性的符号。技术影像呢，它其实可以算是第5级的抽象。他在书里边，在在在这本书里边，就英文原版的福禄瑟这本就是进入到技术影像的宇宙这本书里，他把这个人类对影像的抽象分为5级，从第1级最早的这种洞穴里边的绘画是吧？对一些动物的一种图画。一直到我们现在这个 AI 的这种影像，他认为呢，技术影像是属于第5级的这种抽象，是从科学文本中派生出来了。其实它是掩盖了符号的本质 福禄瑟认为技术影像是一种历史性的转变，是一个 historical shift。它已经使得我们从原来文本的宇宙中，就是如果说我们原来是生活在文本，是用文字来沟通，用字母线性的这种沟通现在已经进入到一种多维的，是甚至没有维度的这么一种用影像来沟通。他认为现在的技术影像是没有维度的，这一点是令人思考的啊。然后他认为呢，如果说传统的影像是属于历史性的影像，是关于历史的影像，现在呢，技术影像是主导着后历史的时代。也就是说，我们过去在讲述历史的时候，是一种线性的去描述，用文字去描述。现在呢，它可以这个全方位的在描述，可以讲关于未来，也可以关于过去，甚至关于当下，也可以关于梦等等。所以这种呢，我们已经进入到一个后历史的时代那么这种技术影像是可以对现实进行中介。那么这个就会产生一种危机，就技术影像的泛滥就会使人类陷入到这个影像的拜物教就混淆了这个符号与现实。就人们现在成天看到了就是大量的影像出现不仅仅我们可能会对网红的一些影像呢感到顶礼膜拜，甚至呢会对有的人呢，当然会对像川普刚才生成的把自己化身为教皇的那种影像呢有这种崇拜感，但是当然也有很多人会提出批评。所以呢，现在我们已经分不清楚到底什么是真的，什么是假的这个就是一个比较悲观的一面，是吧？甚至会造成一个集权式的同质化。也就是说，技术影像它通过这个监控的影像来这个监控社会，这个是比较悲观的一面，是当时福禄瑟在他的这个理论关于技术影像理论中提出了这种可能性，因为他在那个时候就已经预见到了。当然，他也提到了就是一些乐观的一面。他说，如果人类能够主动解码程序，那么技术影像也可以成为对话性的媒介，也就是一个 dialogic media，能够激发创造性的参与比方说像数字艺术开源代码的影像等等。我觉得这一点呢，也是福禄瑟当时就预测到了，就是技术影像其实是一个双刃剑。它像一把刀一样的，可以拿来切菜，是吧？但是同时也可以拿来杀人。技术影像也一样，它会造成这种刚才我们提到的影像拜物和这种集权式的同质化等等，这种以假乱真的这种后果。同时，它其实也可以给我们，如果使用得当的话，让我们的艺术家能够把它作为一个新的媒介来创作。但是我们现在呢，其实当下更重要的一个哲学的任务呢，是要建立影像现象学，所以我就个人认为，像潘洛夫斯基提出的这种图像学呢，其实应该是上世纪，他在那个时候他没有办法预见到技术影像，所以呢，我们国内的很多朋友现在还在用图像这个词呢，其实是要把它改成影像了。AI 生成的影像是绝对是影像，它不是图像，千万不要说是图像。虽然它有可能看上去像绘画，图像是关于绘画，是来自于绘画，叫图像，英文叫 picture 它通常是通过画出来的。技术影像是生成的，它是除非你把它打印出来变成照片以外拿在手里，否则的话，它在我们的这个数码相机的传感器里边，在电脑里边，在 AI 的软件里边，它其实就是一些数据，就是一些代码或者一些 token，是吧？它并不是像传统这个模拟影像那样，或者像绘画一样，所以我们不能把它叫为图像，应该是影像。所以请大家记住。然后呢，我们现在需要建立新的影像现象学来揭示这个技术影像的建构性，同时呢，要对抗它的这个幻觉力，是吗 ？hallucinatory power 这个词是福禄瑟在他的书里边呢早就提到了，所以 所以我觉得福禄社的这个理论呢，它不仅仅警告了我们人们不要被动的消费影像，同时也强调我们人类应该重新扮演这个幻想者，要 visionary，要成为一个幻想，把这个 AI 变成我们的工具，而不是被 AI 所驾驭。因此呢，如果我们能够这样去做的话，技术影像其实还是具有这种解放的潜力。能够解放我们的思维，解放我们的想象力的这种潜力。所以呢，福禄社在上个世纪80年代的这些著作，关于技术影像的这个理论的著作呢，对于媒体研究、对于数字文化以及对于人工智能生成的影像的批判呢，至今仍然非常重要。我就想跟大家分享到这里。谢谢主持人。谢谢弗雷德里钦今天给我们做的非常精彩的这个演讲，我也非常感谢国森老师的参与，以及后台这个 Vera、杨坤还有徐斌等等张晓今后后台所提供的所有的这个支持。那我现在请把这个麦克呢回到这个主持人赞成老
好，
师。
谢谢江荣老师。我也用最简短的一个方式，把我对这些年对 AI 影像的这种思考说一下。对，就是首先呢，我们思考 AI 合成影像的时候，首先呢遇到的一个问题就是这个真实与虚构的问题。那么我呢，有一个，我觉得在思考这个问题之前，有一个大前提，我们人类意识本身，从神经科学来讲，我们是人类意识本身就是虚构的。对，因为我们看到的真正的物理世界，我们实际是看不到的，而且我们不是一个作为主观和世界一个客观二元对立的，因为我们就置身于世界之中。那么我们一切与我们看到的世界，实际就是我们人类生活在世界之中，与世界沟通的这样一种什么的一种模型，或者我们说更简单说就是一种界面。对，就是它这个界面是建立在我们人类感知的这个感知系统是建立在这个上面的。以前我们说语言是一个世界的是我们人类就是说世界的边界就是语言。实际今天在神经科学最新的研究里，这个好像是太片面了。实际上，严格的讲呢，我就不展开了。就是说，语言只是其中的一部分，只是这个模型的一部分，这个界面的一个重要的组成部分，但它并不是全部。所以呢，首先我们要说，所谓的真实，首先是基于我们人类的感知的真实，而不是说那个物理世界的那个真实。那个物理世界的真实，我们只能以我们的感知方式，来感受它的某一个这个侧面或者某一个表象。对，就是我们越是去来看它，它实际是不断的后撤的。对，按照哲学的说法，这个物是不断的后撤的。那么首先呢，在这个模型里。这个人的关于世界的感知，这个模型怎么建立？就是人的大脑本身就是一个制图系统。对，它这个制图系统首先是什么呢？它首先是为了人类在它身处的环境中能够有效的生存，能够维系它的这种内稳态和那个意识的连续性所以它呢，首先在大脑里生成一个认知地图。而这个认知地图呢，如果再加上行为、目的、概念乃至语义的话，就生成了一个呢，以前是心理学的一个概念，那么今天呢，也进入了神经科学领域，就是这个所谓的图示，就是我们你比如说国森去接站也好什么，他马上他的大脑里就有一个图示，就说他要先去下楼，先去坐哪个车，然后他的目的是什么，然后他去到机场如何，他有一个既定的这么一套方式。对，这就是图示，由这些东西不断的在完善我们人类的这种所谓行为思维这样的一种模型。这个里头就包括了我们说这个影像以及其他的图像，包括姜蓉老师刚讲的以前的绘画也好，包括我所有的影像在内，这都是它的一个必要的前提。我们先说完了强调了前提之后呢，我们再说 具体到这种以直接，就是我们以往的以直接摄影的这样的影像，这个它到底有没有真实性？对，或者我们更具体的说，就是我们以前强调的这个所谓的纪实的影像，它到底有没有真实性？如果它有真实性的话，它的真实性在哪里？对。那么我的一个个人的观点，这是我也是经过一个长时间的思考。那么我认为呢，在影像中，我指的是这个传统影像，是有两点可以被视为真实的。第一点就是这个光波，就是我们拍摄的就是这物体的这个反射光嘛，这个表象的反射光，这个光波与这个胶片感光材料之间所形成的物与物之间的这个物理信号的这种传递，这种信号的传递是真实的。它就像什么呢？就像那个阳光照在植物上形成光合作用一样真实。这是没有不受我们人类的干预的这样的一种对。然后第二个呢，就是有摄影师介入的了。那么它的另外一个真实是什么呢？就是摄影师在拍照的时候，他的身体所处的空间位置，尤其是什么呢？就是他的目光啊，我给他起了一个概念，叫目光的注册，就是你的目光，你的意向性看向了哪里，对你关注了哪里，你的那个视觉的，你的注意力，你的焦点，你注意到了这个现实空间中的某物或者某处某个地方，这样的一种这个，因为你的这个视点就是你的立场，就是你的观点，对，也是你的这个意向性所在，就是你看到这个地方就是你的意向的相关项，所以这个呢也是真实的。即使你拍一张假照片，你的这种目光的投注在那个造假的那个地方啊，它也揭示了你这种目光的这种虚伪，而这种揭示本身仍然是真实的。对，所以呢，只是说这两点是真实的。恰恰我们以前说纪实摄影讲的那个真实是不真实的，就是什么呢？影像里头所承载的那个意义啊，那个所传递的让我们观众看到解读的那个意义，那个恰恰是不真实的，是虚构的。对，为什么呢？因为是影像只具有指示性，它并不是事物本身，它并没有得到一个充分的所谓的充实性。具体到新闻摄影，对，我们就以刚才李钦举的讲座里头那个例子，就是黄公吴的那张照片。那么现在连那张照片是不是黄公屋拍的都有争议，和那个何塞已经把这个作者给悬置了，就说到底是谁，现在待确认。你想，连这个都未必是真实的，所以那个照片又怎么能还原那个现场那个事件的真实性？它只是提供了某一个所谓目光的注册而已。它怎么能够还原那个事件本身的真实？所以呢，那个东西是不真实。就是我们以前认为的所谓纪实的影像里所表达的真实，在我看来恰恰是虚构，是不真实的啊。那么为什么黄公吴的这张照片影响这么大？为什么大家都认为它真实？恰恰呢，不是因为它本身真实，而是它什么呢？它就像一个创伤时刻的那个闪回一样，植入了我这个看到这个照片，这个所谓是这个媒体受众的那个记忆之中啊，像个蝎子一样进入了这样的一种，它唤起了每个人不同的创伤性记忆，对。所以呢，就像那个小女孩那个裸露的身体一样，它恰恰就像那个象征界在此刻对被撕开了一道裂口一样。所以呢，这个东西就是一种刺痛啊，就是一种创伤性的记忆，是一个创伤时刻的闪回。所以呢，大家印象都非常深刻，包括这个李钦，刚才讲座里也提到，包括姜荣兄以前我记得也讲过这个事儿，就是为什么这样的新闻照片现在也越来越少，后来乃至这个消失了，实际恰恰是因为这样的一个创伤的时刻，对，它正在被另外的一些东西所淹没。这个再具体到 AI 的技术的这个影像，就这个合成的影像， 那么我对它呢有很多的思考，这里头时间不可能都展开了，我只说几个要点。第一呢，这种技术影像并非自然，对，它是一种按照这种合成影像，它是一种统计算法，是一种概率生成的，对，所以就像我刚才说提到那个次点一样，它已经不再具有现实的某处某物的一个指向性，但是呢，它变成了一个什么呢？变成了一种算法。这种算法之间呢，就那个指令与合成影像之间，又变成了一种我们以往的那个语言与图像之间的关系的另外一种方式。而这种语言呢，到了这里头呢，哎，非常有意思，它变了，它分叉了，变成了一种什么呢？一种数据语言和一种感知性语言。那么就说包括文学在内，那么我们看起来这种能够感受的被人类的这种所谓的感知系统所能够起作用的这个是我们的感知语言，就跟我们传统语言一样。但是不要忘了，生成它背后的那个是数据的语言，是 data。所以这点也是福卢塞尔里面讲到的，就是说，如果刚才姜荣老师也提到了，说如果你要掌控这个东西，对，那么你也要成为一个可以创作数据语言的一个人，对，才能够有效的，才能采取主动性，而不是被动的被他所裹挟，对。那么呢，这个知觉语言和数据语言之间的关系。那么我认为数据语言呢，是我们知觉语言的一个代码，对，而知觉语言是数据语言的什么呢？用一个现象学的话叫奠基，就像科学的世界是被生活世界所奠基一样，这个数据语言为知觉语言实际是数字语言的一个奠基，对。比照这个传统影像，这个合成影像呢，源自更多的那种海量的那样的一种图库的一种生成的，而这个算法本身呢是不透明的啊，所以呢，目光的那个注册，就是我们说原来的那种摄影师的目光的注册，在这里头不再是投入了现实的某处，而是指向了什么呢？指向了一个由数据构成的影像的海洋。这里头让我想到什么？为什么我提到了梦呢？它的依据就在这里。我们知道，我们每天这个眼睛看到的东西是非常多的，但是呢，绝大部分是根本进入不了我们意识的，就是它作为一种瞬间意识，实际是被大脑为了维持它的内稳态，对，它把它给剪除了。对，只有那些个对这个意识产生了印象的，才报告给意识，那叫可报告意识。而大部分意识呢，都变成一种碎片，储存在神经元里。但是来讲呢，并没有报告给意识。但这些东西不会被消失，那个梦就是这么来的。它会在梦里头，在这个所谓的自我参照的这样的一种这个驱动下，重新组合成那个各种奇异的梦境。对。然后呢，这里头呢，我就想到了一个非常有趣的问题，就是快照。你比如说快照，为什么就那种好像是特别不经意的啊，像那种肖尔非常的善于利用快照那种东西，为什么很多的快照的东西让我们感觉那么奇妙？实际快照恰恰是一个什么呢？相当于那个瞬间意识，那个我们平常没有注意到的那个没有进入意识报告的那个东西，忽然间它一旦成为了照片。被它通过这个照片报告给我们意识了，而且它不再是一个这个转瞬即逝的那么一个瞬间就过去那么一个根本就是可忽略的印象了，而是被这个技术所持存啊，可以长久的反复观看把玩这样一个东西，而且它所有的细节，我们不经意的东西都展开啊，这样的话呢，实际给了我们一个非常的这种对我们的感知啊，对我们的这种东西产生一种非常奇妙的效果，所以这也是一个非常有意思的事情。而这种图像的海洋里面被指令所召唤出来的这样的一种合成的影像，它恰恰的会这个很偶发性的出现这样的一种啊，就像我刚提到的，就说指令并不能够彻底的指控那个合成图像，它会出现那个跟你指令那个断裂张力，就是跟你让你意想不到的那个图像会出现，所以这个东西呢，恰恰也是一个非常有意思的一个现象。而这个东西呢，恰恰就是我刚说的，它变成了另外一种次点， 不是我们以前的词典，是另外一个词典。所以就像刚才我们在李琴先生讲座的那个图像里，我们实际也能发现合成图像中也有让我们很惊异的。什么叫那个词典被那个不被现象界那个所谓的秩序那种象征秩序这个所捕获的，是那种断裂的，一下子就像一下子断个口，让我们很惊异，让我们哇看到了一个这个东西，或者是呢勾起了我们某种瞬间意识的一个闪现，就是我们大脑里那个瞬间意识被它所激活，变成这么一个东西。那么就说梦到底真实不真实，对吧？所以呢，这个梦肯定不是真实的，是虚幻的。但是为什么那么多的精神分析学家，而且是从古代开始到今天，大家那么重视梦？为什么呢？梦里没有真实性，但它却有可能生成真理性，就那个 truth，对，它是有可能是这样的。对，所以像荣格呀，什么的这个弗里德也好，拉康也好，非常重视这个东西。他解梦，实际就是为了发现，在虚构的梦里头的那个真理性，那个 truth。所以呢，这个简单解说，就是我对 AI 时代影像的几点思考呢，就说我就挑重点说吧，不都说了。对，就说呢，一个呢是 AI 不仅改变了现实，或者我们说用一个拉康的术语讲，它不仅改变了象征界，实际更改变了什么呢？更改变了我们人类的感知方式。对，那么这个它呢，对于摄影而言，它是以统计学代替了摄影的指示性。对，所以呢，这个哲学家陈嘉映曾经说过，他说我不认为 AI 会越来越像人类，反倒是人类会越来越像 AI。这就是说，AI 改变了人的感知系统，使人的这种对，反而是被这个 AI 所带着走。然后呢，这个大语言模型给我的一个非常大的启发呢，就是这个转喻性。实际在艺术创作和文学写作中，转喻的重要实际是大于这个隐喻的。也就是说，不是那个纵向的，就德勒兹讲的那个树形形状的那个从概念到什么什么那套东西，恰恰是那种转喻链，那种所谓能指链上的那种滑动，它带来了各种新奇的那种奇妙的东西，而这种东西本身会生成意义。那个意义不是你直接从上下来的，而是它本身这种不同的奇妙的组合。而且 AI 给我们做了个最好的证明，就是它根本不懂它在说什么，它仍然能够生成非常我们看起来非常这个甚至比人写的还好的一个文本，就是它完全能够欺骗你的这样一个东西，就完全是因为这个横向的转喻的这种组合性的重要性。对。然后呢，就说这个还有一个问题，就是传统的直接摄影方式，这种直接方式，我特指的是当代摄影，以直接摄影方式进行的当代摄影，这种方法啊，在 AI 时代是否会失效？这个问题很大，我也不展开了。就是因为什么呢？就是因为在 AI 时代，我们将不仅面临的是对象啊，而且更是什么呢？是超对象。这个超对象都是不可见的，或者我们见不全的这个东西，就它不再是我们以前那个视觉直接我们站在这儿看它那个东西，然后我们通过指示性也好，或通过这个暗喻的方式也好啊，就可以这个指向它。这个超对象，它会越来越多，包括 AI 就是超对象，对。然后呢，就说这个还有一个非常重要的观点，我觉得在 AI 时代，与其说要捍卫真相，不如说更重要的是捍卫人类的感知，就属人的感知。对，这个东西呢，就是我们的身体，就是我们身体，我们的身体性，我们的具身性，恰恰是不能被 AI 所替代的。所以，我们作为人类来讲，今天我们应该捍卫感知。如果你连感知都变了，你还谈何真相？因为所有的真相都是由你的建立在你的这种人类的感知系统之上的，是感知的真实。如果你连感知都捍卫不了，那个真相就无从谈起了。而且这个真相，简单说一句吧，就是真相机制，就是何为真相？对，这个何为这个真相，实际是被真相机制所确认的。以前我们叫眼见为实和有图有真相，对吧？我们认为摄影就一定比绘画真，因为那个是手画的，这个是机器自动生成的。对，它是实际是什么叫真相机制？就是我们将真相认定为真相的那样的一种机制。对，所以呢，这个也是一个我们值得思考的问题。 好，最后我刚才提到的摄影呢，这个刚才李钦也一再提到，摄影不等于真实，但是呢，对是否在我们这个 AI 合成的影像里头，对我们还能有有新的可能性。对，我觉得在这点上，我觉得既应该警惕，又应该有所谓的乐观，不是盲目的说等着躺平的乐观，等着乐见其成的乐观，而是我们要用一种主动的态度来对待这个事情，对，来对待这个在 AI 时代如何继续生成我们的主体性，而不是丧失主体性，而AI 会成为一个大他者嘛，会成为一个新的大他者。我们要意识到它的存在，但是我们又不能躺平，要主动。包括弗鲁塞尔讲的对你的这种技术的这种数据语言，你要掌控它。包括你比如说今天出现的故障艺术，对，它就是这个针对 AI 的这样的一种，让它内爆，这样的话也是一种。对，这个我就不详细展开了。好，我今天呢就简单的把我的大概思路就说到这儿就可以了。这个姜蓉老师有什么简单的有什么反馈吗？
没有没有，我觉得你讲的非常好，然后跟李钦的演讲，还有跟我刚才介绍的这个福禄社的技术影像理论，还有刚才国森老师讲的他的感受和他的问题，其实都是相关的。所以我觉得我们今天这个演讲还是非常，和分享会呢是一个蛮好的一个机会，跟大家一块分享一下。
好，谢谢姜蓉。因为今天嘛，摄影界吧，面对 AI 这个时代，也都是有各种各样的观点，是吧？大部分还是相对比较迷茫，有很多人也都是在不断的思考这个事儿。所以我觉得今天这个讲座呢是非常重要的。像这样的话题，我觉得我们以后还会继续的讨论，是吧？继续的进行。那么今天呢，时间也已经很晚了，谢谢各位嘉宾，谢谢看我们节目的观众。好，那么今天的分享就到这里。
感谢各位老师的精彩分享，也感谢大家的用心聆听。本期服务器艺术、当代影像、路径及其可能第13期摄影在 AI 时代的转型线上论坛圆满结束，也非常感谢各院校机构和媒体的大力支持与参与。我们期待下次再见，谢谢。